Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's a small room, so we don't need any amplification. I speak quite loud anyway. But thanks so much for coming. My name is Azim Ibrahim. I'm one of the directors here at the New Lines Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, the word genocide is often used very loosely, and it's often used interchangeably with mass murder. But the word genocide has a very precise legal definition, and that definition was given to us in the 1948 Genocide Convention. And at the heart of this definition is intent, the intention to destroy a group whole or in part. And this intent can be attributed to a state, to the evidence of a general plan, documents, statements, policy, etc. Or it could be inferred, it could be deduced from a systematic pattern of atrocities. According to the Genocide Convention, there's 5 genocidal acts. There's killing, there's causing serious bodily or mental harm, there's deliberately inflicting physical conditions to the destruction of a group, there's birth prevention, and there's forcibly transferring children. Now notice, out of all of those 5 definitions, only one of them is mass murders, is killing, is other forms of genocide. Now how does this apply to the question of Ukraine? Let me just give you a very quick background in terms of how this report came about. The New Lines Institute, a couple of years ago, had done a report on the Uyghur genocide, and that report was quite influential, quite instrumental. 2 weeks after the war in Ukraine started, I was approached by the Deputy Prime Minister's office to ask, can we do a similar report to this on Ukraine? I was invited to Ukraine by the Ministry of Health. I spent some time there speaking to people, gathering evidence. On my return, we put together 3 teams of experts: open source intelligence experts, language experts, and legal scholars. And the conclusion they came to after applying all the evidence is that the Russian Federation is in breach of the Genocide Convention, that the Russian Federation bears state responsibility for inciting genocide. Now this is important, incitement to genocide. And thirdly, that the pattern of atrocities indicates an intent to destroy Ukrainian people as a national group, which is in breach of Article 3C of the Genocide Convention. And none of this should come as a surprise to us. We've seen the rhetoric from Putin emerging well in advance. No genocide ever happens all of a sudden. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It takes many years, decades, generations to lay the foundation for a genocide to occur. For example, Putin, in an essay in 2021, in July, he said, Ukraine is an artificial creation, and he denied that Ukraine has its own language, culture, and history. The chair of the Duma, in February 26th, Vladislav Sukov, said, there is no Ukraine, there is no Ukrainianness. This is a disorder of the mind. There is no nation. We even have Medvedev on record saying, we will do everything to make you disappear, what our grandfathers failed to do. And he said, I hate them, they are bastards and degenerates, I will make them disappear. And we have seen this rhetoric being translated into action. We have reports that we've all seen now of over 180,000 Ukrainian children that were forcibly transferred from Ukraine into Russia to stop and spread out to stop them coalescing as a single identity group. We have intercepted telegram messages between Ukrainian soldiers saying rape the Nazi whores so they don't want to have Ukrainian children. The UN Special Rapporteur has even told us about Viagra being distributed to Russian soldiers to facilitate this. Now, why is all of this important? This is important because the purpose of the Genocide Convention is to prevent and punish genocide. Prevent comes first. The purpose of the Genocide Convention is to prevent. We have a duty to prevent. The Genocide Convention is proactive. It is not reactive after the fact. It is there to stop the genocide proceeding. We've seen extensive evidence of the child transfer, which is what the basis of the ICC indictment of Putin. Now, since our report came out, which focused on incitement to genocide. We have now re-examined all the evidence under the leadership of Professor Christina Hook and now published a new report, and we have moved from incitement to genocide to the commission of genocide. There is now enough evidence to confirm that the Russian Federation is in the process and actively commissioning genocide in Ukraine. And to discuss this report, we have a stellar panel here. Professor Christina Hook, who is the lead author of this report, is an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University School of Conflict Management. She's an expert on Ukrainian-Russian relations and a former Fulbright scholar. She previously served under at the US State Department, and as I said, she is a key author and lead scholar behind this report. We also have Ambassador John Herbst, who is currently a senior director at the Atlantic Council and a former US ambassador to Ukraine. He served 31 years at the State Department. Ambassador David Sheffer requires no introduction. He's been a part of New Links projects from the beginning. He was the US's first ambassador at large for war crimes, and he was one of the key architects of the Yugoslav Tribunal, and it's always a great honour to have him here. And then finally, we have Sarah Teach, an international human rights lawyer and a senior fellow at the Donald Laurier Institute, specialising in international law, human rights and counter-terrorism. Sarah has been a leading advocate on a lot of these issues in Canada, where she's seen as a pioneer. And with that, I will pass it on to Christina Hook to first give us just a quick overview of the key findings of the report and how you came to this conclusion.
Thank you, Azim. It is a pleasure to be here today. And as I go through the report, as I go through some of the findings, I'd like to invite you to think about how many people it is taking to fulfill the coordinated, systematic campaign that this report is laying out. This is a large-scale project, and it is one that, as Azim said, is very much underway. So what our report finds is that we are upholding and also expanding the findings made in May of 2022. We made 3 findings in this report that are worth going into in very precise language, and then I'll talk a little bit about what those mean and the evidence that we're presenting to uphold those. So first of all, in this report, we state that there is reasonable grounds to believe that Russia is responsible for the direct and public incitement to commit genocide. We further say that there is reasonable grounds to believe that Russia is responsible for the commission of genocide against the Ukrainian national group, a position that we support by evidence of a pattern of atrocities from which inference of intent to destroy the Ukrainian national group in part can be drawn, and documented evidence of one or more of the prohibited acts in violation of the Genocide Convention. And we further say that there are signs of serious, escalating genocide and genocidal intent in Ukraine. That has 3 implications. There is a legal obligation of all states to prevent genocide, and this was triggered by the spring of last year. That there are increasing signs of systematic, coordinated efforts by Russian state actors to incite and to commit genocide, and that Russian state actors have further escalated their willful, systematic breaches of the Genocide Convention. So I asked you to think with me about the number of people who are involved in this. I'd also like you to think about this word escalation. If you read our report, you'll see that comes up a lot. So what did we do? What were we looking at? So I think that it is so important to begin every conversation by talking about direct and public incitement to genocide. This is not just something that one shouldn't do, this is a crime. And this was a key finding last year. We looked at it again. Last year, we put Russian state parties on notice that they were in breach of this. And so we looked, has there been any evidence that this is lessening? And our report goes through in great detail an argument that we see no signs that direct and public incitement has lessened in either tone or quantity of message. And unfortunately, we find the opposite. We find escalation. And some of the things that we talk about in this category of direct and public incitement are new tropes that have been introduced about the Ukrainian national group. One common thing that we see in direct and public incitement discourse is mention of de-Satanizing the Ukrainian national group. That wasn't something that was within the media space at the time of the last report. And so willful dehumanizing, demonization, rhetoric like that is emerging. So it is escalating in that category. And then also what is very important is this question of the commission of genocide. And what I'd really like to draw your attention to is that under the UN Genocide Convention, we look at is there documented evidence of one or more of the prohibited acts. And what we find very grievous, what we find very compelling, and what we'd like to draw your attention to in this report is that there is documented evidence that Russian state actors are engaging in prohibited acts in all 5 of the prohibited acts that are in the UN Genocide Convention. That is not necessary, and that is something that is very striking and very important about this report and what we're seeing Russian state actors engage in. So I'd like to just very briefly mention what those are. Azim, you've already told us, and so as you look at the report, I'd invite you to look at the details, to hold us to the facts here. We think we present them very clearly in a compelling way in the report, but a few of the things that we see are made perhaps most obviously killing. But killing has occurred against the Ukrainian national group in a variety of ways. Summary executions, missile strikes, shelling, torture-induced death, the targeting of evacuation caravans or shelters, and then also the killing by omission, which is very important. This is when, for example, population groups are rounded up and members of that group die. There is also a very extensive part of this report that talks about Russian state actors engaging in directed serious mental or physical harm. We present evidence of both, and we present evidence that this is escalating. So there is a lot to go over here, and that is a bad thing. This is an extensive section of the report. But a few things that I want to point out are evidence that it is coordinated, it is systematic, and it is occurring in every area where the Russian state is in control of the Ukrainian population. We point out things such as extensive industrialized torture, we point out rape and conflict-related sexual violence. We also point out that there are documented practices of torture that have gone through the court systems and are associated with the Russian state against their own population that are being exported to Ukraine and to members of the Ukrainian national group that are under Russian state control. And then something else, something that often comes up in the media, but I'd like to draw your attention to in reference to the UN Genocide Convention, are the constant nuclear threats that Russian state actors make. And I'd invite you to consider with me the group that they are making these threats against. The group that would be most immediately affected by this are very often themselves Ukrainians, the victims of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which was called by the World Health Organization the worst civil-made nuclear incident. And now the Russian state actors are making this specific threat against this specific group. We assess that there is willful knowledge that this bears a special mental harm against this group. So we also, just moving quickly, because as I said, this is an extensive report, there is a documented pattern of atrocities that really much more than I have time to go into. But also when we look at this third category of prohibited acts, conditions of life that are designed to target a population. One of the things I'd like to draw on here is this unrelenting attacks on population centers. I'd also like to draw your attention to missile strikes, and I'd invite you to go to the details of the report and what we've documented in it. These are missile strikes that copious evidence shows were targeted during the winter time. And what we do in this report is we lay out what humanitarian actors were assessing the toll on the Ukrainian national group would be. And there were humanitarian actors in the late summer last year talking about how this would impact millions of Ukrainians. And so the timing of this and the usage of these tools, the timing of it during winter are very, very important. We also look at things that you've probably also seen about, but we look at them in a coordinated and systematic way. These are the targeting of healthcare facilities, the targeting of educational facilities, and many other things. And moving very quickly to measures to prevent births, we look at, of course, rape and sexual violence and gender-based violence. This is often looked at in categories for other cases that we examine in human rights work. We also look in this report at emerging reporting about the castration of Ukrainians, particularly service members that are under the control of Russian state actors. And there is this emerging reporting to indicate that this is potentially widespread and a systematic practice. And then finally, something that perhaps many of you in this room know about, the forcible transfer of children. And this is, of course, particularly chilling, and it's particularly obvious what is going on here. As I begin my remarks, I invited you to sort of think with us about the level of the actors that it takes to perpetrate these practices. And the transfer of children, the forcible transfer of children is certainly one of them. And so what we do is we pull together a lot of the work that our colleagues have done on this issue, but we look at it, is it widespread, is it systematic, is it targeting the Ukrainian national group? And what we find is yes to all of these, that there are these patterns of behavior that is very difficult to bring these children home, they're being hidden in the system, but also that it is accompanied with explicit attacks to target the Ukrainian identity. And that is a pattern that we found across these categories of the 5 prohibited acts. And so this is just the beginning of our conversation, but I'll just wrap up my remarks by saying that we have the UN Genocide Convention to prevent and to punish, and it is certainly not enough to document atrocities, and that is clearly part of it, and the case we're laying out today is part of it. But the duty then is to prevent, to stop. And so what we argue in this report is that as Russian state actors are escalating their genocidal practices against the Ukrainian national group, the other signatories of the UN Genocide Convention also have an obligation and a duty to take such measures to protect Ukrainians.
Thanks so much for that, Christina, for that very important overview. It certainly makes a harrowing reading. So when you bring in David, now nobody's got more experience on the actual mechanics of this than David, but I wanted to ask you, David, what are the implications of this? You know, our original report, which you were thoroughly involved with, looked at incitement to genocide. It was very early on in the war, so there wasn't a whole lot of information. We've now moved on to commissioning. What are, first of all, are the implications of this, you know, actually recognising it as an official kind of genocide? And secondly, you're also involved, you know, I believe in the special tribunal, and I know that's related, not necessarily to the ICG kind of apparatus. So what chances do you see, first of all, what are the implications of this finding? And secondly, what are the chances you think that any of this will actually make a difference for global justice?
Well, thank you very much, Azim. It's a great honor to be here again in front of a New Lines Institute audience and with my distinguished colleagues surrounding me here. And Christina, A+, you know, as a international law professor, you just got an A+ on this report. So it's a tremendously helpful document. I think it's important to recognize in the history of atrocities, and what I call atrocity crimes, that's genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Never before in the history of humankind has there been such a significant and rapid recognition, investigation, and pursuit for justice with respect to the commission of atrocity crimes of any conflict, of any situation in world history as in Ukraine. It simply has never happened this fast, this intensively, and that's to be, I think, to reflect how much progress we've made, particularly in the last 30 years with all of the modern war crimes tribunals, that crimes of this character simply cannot be ignored, overlooked, or delayed in terms of our attention to them. Nor can world leaders act with impunity per se. Now, they may think they'll get away with it, and they may have these, and they may ultimately get away with it. But the point is, it simply has reached a stage now where no world leader can actually commit these types of crimes, thinking that that world leader sort of stands behind some kind of shield of impunity. Yes, they may survive the rest of their lives without imprisonment, without trial, because they'll be in the sanctuary of their home country. But it's a very, very different world from what it was even 30 years ago with respect to these individuals. What's so significant about this report in Ukraine is that we really have not had an example of the last 30 years where genocide is really being committed on all of the spokes of acts of genocide that Christina spells out in great detail in her report. Mass killings, of course, define the Rwanda genocide without question. Large-scale killing, a substantial part of a ethnic group, defined Bosnia, particularly the Srebrenica genocide. But when you get beyond those, the Rohingya is a genocide. The Uyghurs are a genocide, but on far more narrow grounds. Whereas with Ukraine, you can take every single act of genocide, not only substantiated with open source evidence, I might add. I don't think, Christina, you had to delve into the intelligence community for this. Whereas back in my day, in the early 90s, I relied heavily on the intelligence community because open source evidence of what was going on in Bosnia, or even at times in Rwanda, was simply not available. So that has changed the dynamic considerably, and it's allowed someone like Christina to look at every single spoke of the acts of genocide that are in the Genocide Convention. Well, one could go on, and marry that now in terms of if one wants to seek out individual criminal responsibility, you'll have to marry any of those acts of genocide with the mens rea, the criminal intent of leaders in Russia, military, civilian leaders, perhaps some of the business community through the oligarchs, and even someone like Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus as an aider and abettor. That means that in the future, when it comes to individual criminal responsibility, there will always be that evidentiary issue of act of genocide, criminal intent, marry the two together, try to reach a guilty verdict. But with respect to state responsibility, it's a very different issue because Russia is acting as a state in committing these crimes, particularly genocide against the people of Ukraine. And that's an issue that doesn't require the level of, beyond a reasonable doubt, proof of criminal intent as you need in a criminal trial. That's something whereby if it comes before the International Court of Justice or in other forums, you can work with a lot of circumstantial evidence to demonstrate that there was an intent to destroy all or part of, in this case, particularly a national group. And by the way, that's one of the unique features of the research here, which is, I think, well, Christina, I know a lot of people work on these things, but you've really sort of established one of the lengthiest treatments of this so far, which is that under the Genocide Convention, we're so used to looking at ethnic, racial, religious groups as the protected groups. In Ukraine, it's the national group, the Ukrainian citizens. And that itself is a historic leap for what we're doing on the crime of genocide in Ukraine. But it's also one that it's just so obviously demonstrated on a daily basis by the Russian government itself, by what its leaders say, by the most self-incriminating leader in the world today. His name is Vladimir Putin. Every single day he incriminates himself. It's an incredible public record of self-incrimination. And that is to go after the national people of Ukraine in every possible way of destruction. And those spokes are in the Genocide Convention, those acts of genocide. So anyway, all of that is just to say that from a, former diplomat and international law professor's perspective, this is a pretty unprecedented event for the crime of genocide in our time, since the Holocaust. And so therefore, putting the attention on it as New Lines Institute has I think is incredibly important. I think it's incredibly important that you were kind of first out of the gate in May 2022, reminding people, guys, it's not just war crimes in Ukraine. In fact, by May of 2022, we were starting to talk about crimes against humanity, but it was only New Lines Institute that was saying to people, wait a minute, it's also the crime of genocide. So, you know, it's a mix of all of these crimes now, and this report certainly puts the crime of genocide front and center, which I'll just close by saying we have years, if not decades, of litigation and also of political, shall we say, settlements and negotiations ahead of us, all framed by the reality of this criminal conduct in this war. And this report, I think, establishes a very good framework for analysis.
Thanks so much for that very important overview, David. I just want to bring in Sarah now. Sarah, you've worked on multiple human rights issues, and you continue to do so. A lot of groundbreaking stuff as far as I've seen. How does this situation differ from all of those, and why can we expect something different this time round? What Putin is doing in Ukraine is nothing new. He's done exactly the same thing in Grozny. He's done the same thing in Syria. You know, I know an American doctor. He was actually the only American physician that was still in Aleppo when it was being bombed. And he told me specifically that they were bombing every single hospital systematically. There was a systematic, organized campaign. They're bombing every hospital. And they moved one of the hospitals underground into an underground car park for that reason. And they brought in special bunker buster bombs to target that as well. So nothing here is new. So how is this situation different from those? And why should we expect a different outcome from your experience?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think building on what my co-panelists have already said, I think what's unique about this is that it's on all 5 spokes. And as Professor Hook mentioned, that's not even necessary for finding of genocide, right? But it is, it's powerful. So the fact that we have all 5 spokes paired with the specific intent to destroy a national group means that this is different than other genocides we've been dealing with. And as also we've talked about, the international response is quite unprecedented. So in practice, it's also very different because we've seen this, you know, many countries referring the situation to the ICC right off the bat. We've seen refugees being brought in, you know, places in Europe and elsewhere at an unprecedented rate. With the Uyghurs, I worked with Canadian parliamentarians to pass M62 recently, which resolved to bring in 10,000 Uyghur refugees from unsafe third countries to Canada. That took years, right? And with Ukraine, we saw refugee resettlement very quickly. And perhaps it's because, you know, one argument I've seen is that they're expected to go back, whereas Uyghur refugees are going to be resettled permanently in Canada. But, you know, whatever the explanation, it's the international response on this, and the fact that everyone sort of has come together is really unique and really special. And I hope that we bring that and we learn that lesson and apply it to other places, because as much as it is different, it shouldn't have taken 2 years to have M62 pass in Canada. It shouldn't take years and years to have genocide determinations made about other conflicts, even if it's on just 1 or 2 spokes. So I think it's unique and it's special and it's wonderful, but it's also should provide us with some lessons learned for future conflicts.
Thanks for that. And John, nobody has more experience than yourself of the region. You obviously served in Ukraine and other countries in the region as an ambassador. You spent 31 years as a diplomat with the State Department. What seems to be the reluctance from the State Department to officially recognise this as a genocide? They have done so with other genocides, most recently the Rohingya one, but before that the Uyghur. And the evidence now, as you've seen, is overwhelming. All 5 criteria have been met. What is the reluctance of the State Department, and how do we get them over the line?
I'm delighted to be on this panel, and thank you for the question. I need to apologize, I believe in 7 minutes to another obligation. Look, this is not on the State Department. This is on the administration. And you have to credit the administration for responding in a comprehensive and, careful with my words here, strong enough response to the huge challenge created by Putin's conventional invasion of Ukraine 17 plus months ago. That's a real achievement. But notice I said strong enough. Maybe I should have said barely strong approach. The administration is of two, even three minds in regard to the challenge to American interests posed by this invasion of Ukraine. If they saw things with strategic clarity, if they would note that among the many things said by senior Russian officials, including Putin, in addition to the things which clearly prevent evidence for genocide, is that their ambitions, their aggressive ambitions, go beyond Ukraine. They extend at a minimum to the territory of the former Soviet Union, which happens to include 3 NATO members. And therefore, were Putin to achieve his objective in Ukraine is to have effective political control of the country, we would face the same Russian problem in regard to our NATO allies, the 3 Baltic states, and maybe Poland, and maybe Romania, and maybe Bulgaria. So you don't have that strategic clarity in the administration. And instead, you have the laudable instinct that, gee, if Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, that would be a disaster. Yes, good. But then they have other instincts, which also condition the policy. A second instinct with which I am completely sympathetic, that American soldiers should not be fighting in Ukraine. Okay. It's the third instinct that's the problem. Actually, there are 4 instincts. The third is the major problem, which is we don't want to be in a nuclear war with Putin. I agree. We don't want to be in a nuclear war. And we have, let's see now, over 70 years of diplomatic experience in the nuclear world, and not once before the Biden administration, when we were going toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union over Berlin in '61, over Cuba in '62, not once did a senior American official say publicly, we can't do X because our adversary may go nuclear. Now, of course, any statesperson needs to consider this in the secrecy of the sit room and draw proper conclusions. When you say that, you are signaling that they can bully you. And that's what's happened. So this is a very important negative factor in our policy. And then the last issue, not as important as the third, is we are afraid of Russia fracture. Now, I don't want Russia to fracture either, by the way. But that is a far less important, that is an issue of far less gravity than making sure Moscow's aggression does not succeed. And so those factors, 3 and 4, get in the way of a clear, strong policy on this. A strong policy which would have us supply Ukraine all the weapons they need to truly defeat the Russians on the battlefield. And by the way, the White House has become an amazing spin machine for throwing out a bunch of fog as to why we're not sending weapons. We have enough ATACMS to send. We can send F-16s. We can send more Patriots. It's done out of that fear of Russian escalation. Behavior on becoming a superpower. Okay, that relates to your question. Were we to declare unequivocally that this is genocide, certain things follow in our policy, which would get in the way of offering Putin that piece of sausage that would enable him to make a compromise, or maybe make a compromise on Ukraine, which he won't. He won't. If we want to negotiate a true settlement to this war, meaning a settlement which does not lead to the next war, Putin has to lose big time on the battlefield of Ukraine. The administration has not grasped that basic truth yet. So that's the answer to your question. And with that, I have to run.
Thanks so much, John. See you tomorrow. So with that, I'll open it up to the audience. If you have any questions, just say your name, identify yourself, and which panelist you're addressing.
Yes, my name is Greg Wojcicki. I'm with the Housing for Ukraine team. I work on government affairs on the Hill. Kind of question to whoever wants to answer it. It was kind of, I was going to approach the disconnect between sort of the legality of the recognition of what Russia's doing in Ukraine to the political consequences of that, and I think the ambassador answered that very well. But even on the Hill, even today, during the hearing on child deportations, we saw a split opinion as to whether, legally speaking, what is happening in Ukraine could be considered genocidal. And to me, at least, as a non-lawyer, it seems quite simple. The forcible transfer of children is already one of the articles of the Genocide Convention that's been breached. Therefore, that recognition should be legitimate. Why is it not so simple? Why is there a disconnect between what seems very clear legally and even the messaging from some of your most staunch Ukraine supporters on the Hill still don't seem to fully feel comfortable calling this what it is? And so I'm just kind of interested in understanding why this disconnect exists, and then what can we do, even on the Gosling team, what can we do to kind of bridge that disconnect?
Is there anyone in particular you want to?
Anyone who feels
Okay.
comfortable.
I think we all can.
Yeah.
I mean, we could all
Sarah,
go
why don't
down
you
the
go
line.
first?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I just more, generally speaking, it's not enough to have the forcible transfer of children. The Genocide Convention requires one of the 5 acts, not 5 out of 5, but that's, that works too. But one out of the 5 acts paired with the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, religious, racial, or national group. So that intent piece is often the hardest to prove. And that's what reports like these do, right? They look not just at the 5 acts, but also the intention, which you can, deduce from statements by senior officials, including Putin and other types of evidence like that. And I don't want to monopolize, so let's carry on.
No, that's, Sarah's exactly right. I would also say it's a little complicated or confused in the public perception because the arrest warrants out of the ICC are war crimes arrest warrants. In other words, infractions of war crimes related to the forcible transfer or deportation of children from one jurisdiction to, the aggressor's jurisdiction, in this case, Russia. So there's already a pretty firm view out there that yes, we've got him on war crimes. Why is this also genocide? And as Sarah points out, yes, and Christina, yes, you can now, well, we can get to genocide pretty quickly. You should understand that the war crimes tribunals, prosecutors very often will combine the same events in different baskets of crimes. In other words, an event of a war crime will also be charged as a crime against humanity, sometimes almost in the alternative. In other words, if the judges don't buy the war crimes charge, they will buy the crimes against humanity or vice versa. What they're not so used to doing is genocide. However, even in the Bosnian situation, there was a big contest over what happened in 1992 in Bosnia. Was it just crimes against humanity, or was it also genocide? And there was a huge debate about that was never, well, it was resolved in favor of just being crimes against humanity by the Yugoslav tribunal. But you can see how you can get different baskets of crimes working together once they get before the war crimes tribunal.
So I fully agree with everything my two panelists said, and they set me up to take one final aspect that we can think about. So the first thing I'd like to say is our report lays out the types of evidence that we need to fulfill the criteria that they talked about. And that's very important because that alone is a legal obligation. And so that's very important, that's enough. But I'd also, just thinking strategically about how we can help and equip our policymaker friends, I'd like to invite those in the policy community where I've spent a significant amount of my career working on how do you stop a genocide in progress, how do you prevent genocide. I'd like to invite them to think about understanding it as a genocide as not a negative that they need to run away from, but a positive that will help them do their job better. This is the correct diagnosis of the violence that we're seeing. If you want to solve a problem, you do have to diagnose it correctly. And so we lay out the diagnosis in this report, but really what I spend a lot of my day job doing is thinking about, now that we understand it's a genocide, we understand that it is a complex social and political behavior that is going on, that I alluded to all of the actors that we talk about. We have to understand what we're looking at if we're going to actively solve this problem. And so looking at it, understanding its proper diagnosis as a genocide, is not just a legal obligation that we must do, but it's something that also can help our policymaker colleagues and friends do their job better to solve this problem and to fulfill those legal obligations.
Yeah, no, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my own very limited understanding of the situation is that once a genocide is officially recognised, it obligates the states to behave in a particular fashion under the Genocide Convention. And many countries, as the ambassador alluded to, don't want to do that. They don't want to be restricted. They want to negotiate with Putin. They want to come to an understanding. Whatever it may be, once it's declared genocide, you simply cannot have an architect of genocide still in power and you're negotiating with them. That's simply not viable. And it reminds me of in Samantha Power's book, she mentions the Rwanda situation. There was a memo that was leaked, and it said it went from one government department to the other. It said, "Be careful, legal state trying to classify this as a genocide will compel us to do something." So when there's no political appetite to undertake a particular course of action, then they'll obfuscate and confuse the issue. So one of the things that policymakers do, which I've seen happen quite often, particularly in the UK, is that, well, look, we can't call it a genocide until the International Criminal Court or some other court decides it is. And that's simply not true. No court is there to actually make a determination as such. The State Department and Foreign Office, etc., have their own internal mechanisms. All diplomacy is conducted between states. It's not conducted in court. So if the political appetite is not there, then it won't be recognised as a genocide. So that's my kind of understanding of the situation. Yeah.
Can I just jump in, because you're coming from the Hill, right? Or you're talking about how you make this case on
Yes,
the Hill.
and there's a piece of a resolution stuck in the Senate that has 20 co-sponsors, which is a very healthy number, bipartisan, it's kind of just stuck. And there's a big part that's political will. There's also some messaging disconnects there too.
Can I suggest, I want to take a step beyond what Azim just said regarding the duty to prevent, which gives rise to this, you've got to do something once, as a state, you see that genocide is taking place. We, of course, dealt with this in the 90s with Rwanda, as was explained, but it's so different now because that issue is behind us. The United States has responded with about $76 billion in military equipment and other defensive, where we are helping the Ukrainians confront the Russian aggression and armed attack on their country, which gives rise to all of these crimes. So you don't have to make the argument anymore that, oh my goodness, if we acknowledge that this is genocide, it's going to create some new obligation for the United States. My goodness, if we'd have this kind of response in the spring of 1994 in Rwanda, saying, let's get about $20 billion worth of military assistance in there to the RPF to stop the Hutus from, continuing the genocide, that would have been a very significant U.S. response under the Genocide Convention to genocide. So I just think the issue is behind us now. And so therefore you don't have to be intimidated by calling something genocide in Ukraine. Certainly not in terms of U.S. responsibility.
So what would you recommend, David, to Razom and others who are aggressively they're pushing this issue on the Hill, and they are going to push back to recognise this as a genocide and pass a vote on this?
Right. I would argue to the senators, ultimately the House too, I suppose, that the corpus of crimes being committed in Ukraine obviously has reached a level of all three categories: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And that if your concern is, does this create some new obligation for the United States to recognize that genocide is occurring in Ukraine, I would actually say not a new obligation, because we're already acting in a manner that can be easily translated as a response to genocide in Ukraine. You just have to change the words from a response to aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And by the way, today we just recognized it's also a response to genocide, but we're not changing anything. We're still sending billions of dollars. We want Ukraine to prevail and to stop it. And we have already proven that. So it's nothing new.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of time, so I'll take a few of the questions together.
I just want to make a quick comment. I mean, I don't understand why the United States would deter from, prevent itself from recognizing it as genocide. I mean, they recognize the Uyghur genocide, but as a Uyghur, I don't see anything meaningfully being done. I mean, we are not even getting 1% of the attention, the level of support that Ukraine has. Like, we have a case sitting at the ICC since 2020. Not a single country has came to support it. So I don't understand, like, this argument that they're making that, oh, we'd be compelled to do something. I mean, if anything, the US could just be like, hey, we recognize the Uyghur genocide. They're still negotiating with China. In fact, you have the current administration possibly thinking of, trading away Uyghur sanctions, the minimal sanctions that they have done in exchange for counter narcotics cooperation with China. I think that's just, I don't buy this argument.
Okay, that's a very good question, and there was a question here as well from you.
Yeah, this is for all panelists. I'm Dr. Daniel Johnson.
Yeah, go ahead.
From ACAPS, we're a humanitarian analytical organization. And I am interested in this open source information piece that you highlighted. And I'm curious, because to some extent this is unprecedented, how documentation is happening in real time, how engaged with civil society and ordinary citizens this process is. So how does this create challenges and opportunities, both for documenting the crime of genocide, for prosecuting it, but also for broader conceptualizations of transitional justice during protracted violence, but also in the aftermath?
So
Christina, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. So I can mention, I think that you actually answered this question a little bit later earlier, talking about the role of open source information. That was very important. What was very important for our team is also just to bring together various types of expertise. So legal expertise, multiple contributors to this report have lived in Ukraine, speak Ukrainian, can read material, talk with both international investigators as well as Ukrainian investigators. Linguistic expertise, looking at nuance, looking at things in their original language. So again, I think you answered the part about we have this opportunity because of our access to information, but let's use it and let's solve big problems in a collaborative process. That's been really important as well. We always say that data is just data until it's analyzed and then it's turned into knowledge. And so we think that we've made the step of bringing all this data together, turning it into knowledge. And you'll hear me say this again before the event is out, but now it's knowledge. Now it's time to turn this into action.
So the first question, do you want me to take that, David? And that's a very good point. The US has recognised the Uyghur genocide, but they haven't received $76 billion. So, and here we are campaigning for the Ukraine to be recognised as genocide. And
Well, one of the issues, of course, is the vast difference between there being a war that sensitizes the issue in Ukraine, whereas we're not in a military conflict with China. I would say the administration would probably answer your question, if not openly, then to themselves, they would answer your question by saying, yes, we know we have an obligation under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. The Genocide Convention does not stipulate what that response should be state by state. And the United States could fairly easily say, as disagreeable as it may be, that, well, we have taken steps. There are a certain set of sanctions that we have imposed, particularly on individuals associated with it, on trade issues. And also we bring it up in every diplomatic exchange we have. Antony Blinken has been, attesting that he does bring it up. So they can say that at least there's that reaction. It's not that the United States is doing nothing. It's made a determination, some sanctions, diplomatic dialogue. But of course, there's always the argument of, well, what more could one do? And that takes us down many other paths. I just wanted to say on open source information, the first word that came to my mind when you were speaking was coordination. It's a massive issue in Ukraine. We've got so much of civil society, so many governments and international organizations involved in data collection, evidence collection. I don't know the vast coordinating effort at this point in Ukraine. I don't know if there is a vast coordinated effort, other than just seeing a lot of different reports come out, a lot of it based on open source, but you know, if the United States reports on what's going on in Ukraine in its annual human rights report, you know that sourcing is coming not just from open source, but other sources. But the coordination of all of that and how a prosecutor in particular sifts through all of that and builds a case with evidence that can be persuasive in a courtroom is another matter. But it is a coordination issue. Sir?
I guess, and the one thing I would add is, in terms of potential challenge, is the way that evidence is collected, particularly looking towards the future action prosecutions, whether that's at, you know, international courts or universal jurisdiction cases. You know, there's a possibility with civil society, of course, especially untrained non-lawyers, the way that they may interview potential witnesses could possibly take testimony going forward. So that's why this coordination piece is also so important. And we see with other contexts like the Accountability Project in Sri Lanka, which is under the OHCHR, which is, you know, doing great work on this. And there's a trade-off, right, between the fastness of this response and the importance of doing it right. So that's a balance that needs to be struck.
Thanks so much. Unless there's any other really pressing questions, want to wrap up. But before I do so, I should let you know that we have another event tomorrow at jointly with the Atlantic Council at the University Club at 1:30, and that is looking at the question of the reparations model of getting reparations for Ukraine. So Ambassador John Herbst will be on the panel with us there, along with Philip Zelikow, the former Chief Legal Counsel at the State Department. So please do attend that. And with that, I'll just want to wrap it up and give a sincere thanks to our speakers for making the effort to come out here today and speak at our event. And feel free to take copies of the report, this report and others.
Christina,